This is your recap lesson on stress, and this is for Unit 2, Behaviour and Discipline. This is your exam unit. So, what is stress? We can define stress as physical, mental, or emotional strain. Stress is the body's reaction to feeling threatened or under pressure. It's very common, and despite often being associated with mostly negative outcomes, it can actually help us motivate us to achieve things in our daily lives and be more proactive and perform at a higher standard. Stress can be positive if it's used properly at the right amount. An excessive amount of stress, however, particularly for a long time, can have a negative impact on our mental, emotional, and physical health. Some of the negative impacts of stress, and again the right amount of stress, is it can improve our cognitive function. We can focus better when we're under that little bit of pressure to get things done. And because we need to get things done, it can motivate us to succeed. Again, this is the right amount of stress at the right amount of time. Dealing with stressful situations can make future ones easier to manage. So when we've experienced that stressful situation in the past, for example, arresting somebody, then the next time we have to do that, we are more prepared for it and we can deal with that easier. We can manage that stressful situation easier at that point. It can increase our immunity in the short term. So when we have a little bit of stress, our body says, right, we have to work hard here. So it helps us improve our immunity because we don't have time to be feeling ill at that point. Now again, very short term, if we have a high level of stress for too long, it becomes excessive, and then we have the opposite effect, which we'll look at soon. And it can make us stronger. So when we're put into a stressful situation, the fight, flight, or freeze kicks in. And if the fight or flight kicks in, then we become a little bit stronger because again, our body is preparing us to fight whatever the danger is or to run away from it. So we physically can become stronger. And like I said at the beginning, all of these are conditional on the right amount of stress being applied. So let's look at what is an excessive amount of stress, because we talked there about the benefits of having the right amount of stress, but what's some of the excessive stress levels? Well, if the amount of stress applied to our body or mind is too much, we will start to experience some negative side effects. Too much stress can affect our mood, our body, our relationships, and especially if we feel out of control because of it. It can make us feel anxious or irritable, and it can also affect our self-esteem. Experienced stress levels over a long period of time can also lead to feelings of physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion, and we can refer to this as burnout. So next, we need to look at how do we identify excessive stress levels. Well, the first bit is the physical symptoms, and the physical symptoms that we might expect to see in ourselves or other people who have excessive amount of stress would be headaches or dizziness, muscle tension or pain, potentially some stomach problems or digestion problems, and chest pains or a faster heartbeat. Now, these are just some of the physical symptoms. Everyone's going to deal with stress in their own way and in different ways, but they may experience some of these physical symptoms or they may not. They may only demonstrate mental symptoms such as difficulty concentrating. And this could be on difficult tasks or it could be in quite relatively easy tasks. Struggling to make decisions. So again, some very easy decisions. It could be something as simple as what would you like to eat? And people who are stressed generally find making even these simple decisions very, very challenging. We may start to feel overwhelmed. We may start to constantly worry about the outcomes of what is happening to us. And with all this happening, we do struggle to remember what we need to do, and we become more forgetful. The third thing that we might be able to identify stress with would be changes to our behavior. This is where we might start to become irritable or snappy. We might end up sleeping too much or too little. Our sleeping patterns will start to change. We, again, similar to the sleeping patterns, our eating patterns might start to change. We might start eating too much or too little. We will start avoiding certain places or certain people because trying to manage being in that environment is too stressful for us, and it's adding to that excessive stress levels. And then we may start to take up some negative behaviors such as drinking or smoking more. So next we're going to look at some of the causes of stress, and there's three main areas that we can receive stress from or might cause stress in our lives. The first one is external factors. And these are things that are happening to us. It could be stuff like trauma, or have we been in a traumatic experience? It could be changes in our personal circumstances, in the relationships that we have, in the environment that we are. It could be our job, it could be our home life, something may have changed. It could be that we've witnessed violence, war, or terrorism. And it could be that we have lost a family member, a friend, or a colleague. All of these are external factors which may increase the amount of stress you're dealing with at any one time. Some of these may be short-term. For example, changes in personal circumstances might be short-term, but they could also be long-term. So these are things that we have to be aware of when we are managing stressful situations, that these can all increase the amount of stress that we're trying to manage. Next is internal factors. And these are things like the type of personality we have. We spoke about earlier on in some of the previous recap lessons that type A personalities are more prone to an excessive amount of stress. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves and we become more stressful more easily than type B personalities. Our thoughts can also have an internal factor which can cause stress. How we think about things. Are we running things through our mind over and over again? Are we worrying about things? And finally, memories, things from the past, things that happened to us in the past. And memories aren't often very good, and we often remember things in certain ways. And sometimes we can remember things in negative ways, which can increase the amount of stress that we have. And one of the final causes of stress in life could be pressures in life. This could be homework responsibilities. There's been numerous research studies which shows that work-life balances are often skewed in favor of work. And this can add a lot of additional pressure onto people. So if you have unbalanced work-life responsibilities, you may also be a type A personality, and you may have gone through a traumatic event or lost a family member or a friend. All of these can combine to be an excessive amount of stress for that time period. More pressures in life could be unforeseen events, and these could be positive or negative things. For example, potentially moving a house. That would be could also be a changed circumstance, but it could be an unforeseen event, potentially moving to a better house. Then all that, while it's a positive thing, it is still causing stress in our lives, and it's something that we have to manage and deal with. And finally is personal relationships. Now, all of the things we just mentioned about the external pressures, internal pressures, pressures in life, these have all can all take a toll on how we manage our personal relationships also. And we have to make sure that we are looking after those, because those can cause, if we do not look after them, they can potentially cause a lot of additional stress. The stress vulnerability model from Zubin and Spring from 1977, the aim of this model was to address the issue of why some people develop psychiatric disorders and others do not, depending on how much stress they have. As the title would suggest, there are two main factors when it comes to explaining somebody's stress vulnerability. The first one is a biological vulnerability, and then somebody's susceptibility to mental health disorders. These are dictated by genetics and early life experiences. The model suggests that an individual has a unique biological, psychological, and social elements to it. These elements are included in the strength and vulnerability of dealing with stress. There is a degree of genetic predisposition and an association of trauma which equates to the level of stress. So if we are more genetically predisposed to not manage stress very well and become stressful very, very easily, then we're going to have a higher vulnerability in this stress vulnerability model. Another aspect that can affect the stress vulnerability model would be any medication, any alcohol, or any recreational drug use. Individuals can manage their stress more effectively by using some coping skills, which we'll look at later on, but also having a social support network and taking part in meaningful activities. Some of the key vocabulary for this section is going to be biological vulnerability. more likely to suffer from a particular illness such as asthma or heart disease. That is what we refer to as biological vulnerability. And one's ability to manage stress could also be part of biological vulnerability. And then obviously the key term for this, stress: physical, mental, emotional strain. Biological vulnerability is based on family history and our own early life experiences. Individuals can be more likely to suffer from psychiatric disorders such as depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, like having panic attacks, and post-traumatic stress disorder, because of their family history. If somebody in your immediate family has had those before or is more susceptible to those, we are more susceptible to them also. Although these vulnerabilities can be decided by factors like genetics, individuals can also limit the impact of this through the use of medication and avoiding alcohol and drugs. Some of the main factors of the stress vulnerability model is alcohol and drug use or medication use. So alcohol and drug can increase our vulnerability, and medication use, as long as used as prescribed, can decrease our vulnerability. Additional stress levels may also have a factor on how vulnerable we are to stress. These small stressors, also you could refer to them as micro stress doses. If these all build up, then that could be that additional stress. So when one big thing does happen, we're already at a higher level and have less room to cope with that additional stress. How well we use our coping skills, which we'll look at soon, and the social support network and the meaningful activities. The symptoms of stress can be improved by addressing one or more of these factors. So the drug and alcohol use, using drugs and alcohol will increase someone's vulnerability to stress. Substance use can trigger a psychiatric disorder and lead to more severe symptoms later on in life. We talked about additional stress. So stress can be worsen the biological vulnerability and it can worsen its symptoms. Stress is anything that challenges an individual and makes them to adapt. So again, stress can be a good thing, but if we have too much of it, it can lead into more serious stressful events such as losing a loved one, getting fired from a job, being a victim of a crime. These are all things that could push somebody over the edge. So while we have a range of healthy stressors, these serious stressful events could push us over the edge into an excessive amount of stress. And we said at the beginning, stress is often associated with negative events, but there's loads of positive events and experiences that may be stressful as well. I used the example of moving house. It's an exciting time, but there's lots of paperwork to do, lots of things to move, and the cleaning, and getting everything organized. That can still be stressful, even though it's an exciting, positive thing. Factors that contribute to stress could include some negative factors that could contribute to stress could include harassment, discrimination, or bullying. So next, looking at some of the coping skills that we can develop to manage stress. So stress is going to be a normal part of life. Everything we do causes some stress, and again, some of it could be good stresses, but we need to make sure it doesn't become excessive. Developing coping strategies can help with our ability to handle stress and can reduce the negative effects and can reduce our vulnerability to it. This can be things such as relaxation skills, social skills to deal with conflict effectively, time management skills so we don't get overrun with different tasks. And where exposure to stress is prolonged, so over a long period of time, this can lead to an abnormal behavior such as developing phobias, panic anxiety disorders, or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. One of the other methods that we can use to manage stress is having a social support network around us. So it's going to be a very useful way to reduce those negative effects of excessive stress. This comes from having close and meaningful relationships with other people. This can be used to help individuals solve problems, support developing with their coping strategies. It can even just make them feel important or cared about, and because of these feelings, we're more likely to manage that stress better. People who have a good social support network are less vulnerable to the effects of stress and reduces our stress vulnerability. And finally, having some meaningful activities to do can also help manage the stress. When an individual has something meaningful to do with their time, it gives them a sense of purpose. It reduces the stress of having nothing to do. These sort of meaningful activities could be anything from a job that you like doing, school, being a parent, volunteering, or even just hobbies. But having this community, which will often link back into having those positive relationships with others that help us with a support network, these meaningful activities can also help give us direction, give us a purpose in life also. Another theory that we can look at to explain how we manage stress is the general adaptation syndrome. The general adaptation syndrome explains the different stages of stress and how we react to different stressful situations. These are important in understanding how we can manage it by spotting those early signs, the alarm stage, so we can start to manage it before it gets into the exhaustion phase. It identifies 3-stage process which describes the physiological changes our body goes through while under stress. The first stage, as you can see, is the alarm stage. So this is the initial symptoms that the body experiences under stress. This can include our fight, flight, or freeze mechanism, and it's how we respond to when an individual will either walk away or rise to the challenge of a stressful situation. In some instances, we will just freeze and do nothing. But the first things that sort of happen to our body is the heart rate will start to increase. The adrenaline will start to release cortisol, that stress hormone, and the individual will receive a boost of adrenaline, which will also increase our energy levels. This is so we can deal with whatever stressful situation we are up against. The second stage of the general adaptation syndrome is the resistance stage. So after the initial shock, as you can see in the alarm stage, the body's performance drops slightly before increasing quite quickly. After the initial shock, the body begins to repair itself. It starts to release a lower amount of cortisol, but the cortisol doesn't stop. And that's why it's that long-term stress which is the problem. The cortisol doesn't stop, but it does reduce. The heart rate and the blood pressure will begin to return back to normal rates. Although the body enters this recovery phase, it still remains on high alert. It's ready to go again in case it needs to deal with that stressful situation again. If an individual can overcome that stress, that's the best outcome for this. We can deal with the stress, bring it straight back down to normal levels. The body will continue to repair itself, and then the hormone levels, the heart rate, the blood pressure all return back down to normal. That's exactly what we want. However, if the stress continues, then the body will remain on high alert. It will eventually adapt to the stressor and learns how to live with this higher level of stress without really managing and dealing with the internal processes. Now, at this stage, the body goes through changes to try and cope with the stress. It continues to release the stress hormone, so the cortisol is still getting released. We haven't dealt with the situation, so the cortisol is still having that effect on our body. And because of that, we start to see signs of resistance stage, which could include irritability, frustration, poor concentration. And if this stage continues for too long without a proper break, it can lead to the exhaustion phase, which is stage 3. In the exhaustion stage, this is the result of chronic stress. Struggling with stress for long periods of time is a physical, mental, and emotional drain on ourselves to the point where the body can no longer fight that stress off. The physical, so before we had some of the mental effects of stress, the irritability and poor concentration, but now we're starting to see some of the physical effects. So some of the physical effects that we would expect to see from the exhaustion phase would be fatigue, burnout, depression, anxiety, and also a decreased tolerance to stress. The more times we reach the exhaustion stage, the less we're able to manage it in the future. So even if we manage to deal with stress in the exhaustion phase, the next time a stressor comes along, we're not able to deal with that stress as much. If we think back to the stress vulnerability model, it essentially, if we keep putting ourselves into the exhaustion stage, it increases our stress vulnerability. Now, what is stressful can be individual to a person, and this is where the individual perception of the demand. So in class, I use the example of standing in front of a group of people and having to teach them something. For most students, that could be quite a stressful situation, but for a teacher, that's just going to work. So for an individual's reaction can be formed based on experiences and maturity. So teachers have been teaching for a long time, they are more used to it, it's not as stressful for them anymore. And another example, this could be exams. So sitting an exam for the first time will cause a different level of stress to one where you're sitting it for the 5th or 6th time, because you know what the exam process is, you know what's expected of you in the exam, and you know how to behave. A police officer in a real world context, a police officer conducting an interview for the first time is going to be more stressful than a police officer interviewing for the 10th time. They might be worried that they might say something wrong or forget to ask something in the first time, but as they get more experience and they become a bit more mature, they start to develop the demand, the stressfulness of the situation starts to decrease. The more experience in both scenarios that we just spoke about, it makes it easier for the individual to feel like they have the skills to manage this situation. And this leads to behavioral consequences. Do we believe we have the ability to cope with this perceived demand? And this is based on an individual's own thought process. Behavior that is irrational and negative will result in irritability, verbal language that is harmful, and can cause physical harm and overthinking. There are many times when individuals will lose their temper and then go back and regret later on. Now, in the Uniform Protective Service, individuals will often appraise, will reflect and review their own behavior after an incident and see, how could I have improved in that? They will consider how would they have handled that situation differently if they come across in the future. And this is really key to having that growth mindset that we spoke about back in the attitude recap. Having that growth mindset that we're always improving, we're always becoming better at what we do. So some measures and strategies for coping with stress. First positive measure is, where possible, can I remove the causes of distress? Now, sometimes you can. Sometimes you can, for example, if you are working too much and you've got college work, you can start to reduce some of your hours, give yourself more time. You could take more breaks. There's things that you can do to remove that stress. Sometimes you can't take away that stress. It could be, for example, a personal circumstance. It could be a trauma. You cannot affect that stress. You have to try and manage it. Using psychological therapy can have a really positive impact on how we manage that stress, and a reliance on a social support network. Having the support of those people around us can really help cope with stress. Some of the negative impacts of not coping well with stress, we will start to see people become withdrawn and isolate themselves. They will often try and self-medicate with alcohol and drugs. And then both of these, the withdrawal, isolation, the self-medication, can often lead to destructive behavior, where they are not necessarily physically harming themselves, but it could just be that they are socially or emotionally harming themselves and their own development. And it could also lead to things such as aggressive behavior, which again, all of these can lead into those negative impacts of not coping well with stress. Professor Gary Cooper in 2018 said that in life, there's always a solution to a problem. And some of the ways that we can affect managing the stress is we can be more active. Exercise has been shown time and time again that it is able to reduce the intensity that we feel stress. It's a great way, it's a great positive way of dealing with those stressors. We can also start taking control of the situation itself. Now, sometimes, for example, for trauma, for a major incident, we cannot necessarily take control of the whole situation, but we can take control of our own actions. And that starts to make us feel empowered that we have the ability to find a solution. We can control how we behave and deal with that specific situation. And then finally, connecting with friends. A good support network of colleagues, friends, family, someone that you can speak to and share your concerns with is going to have a brilliant impact on your ability to manage stress. Next is having some me time. So setting aside, so lives can be busy and we're often given a lot of our time away to other people. So having some me time, setting aside time each week for some time just to do something that you want to do. It could be playing computer games, it could be hanging out with friends, it could be watching your favorite TV show, whatever it may be. There's lots of people wanting your time, work, college, family, friends. Do something for yourself. Next one is challenging yourself, setting yourself goals and challenges to help build confidence and deal with stress. That sort of comes back to the taking control of the situation. When you set yourself that goal, you have a direction on which to work towards. So having that challenge for yourself can help alleviate stress because you have a direction to go in. And of course, avoiding unhealthy habits. So avoiding, where possible, any alcohol, smoking, caffeine, unhealthy food as a way of coping. Now, for example, caffeine and unhealthy foods, these are starting to become quite a normal part of our society. But as long as we're not using them as a way of coping with a stressful situation and we're using them in a responsible manner, they're okay. But it's where these start to become part of our coping strategy, they can become excessive. And finally, these meaningful activities. So helping each other has proven time and time again that when we help other people through activities such as volunteering, community work, we can ourselves become more resilient. We have purpose. We are doing something good in the world. And by having that, we are able to manage our stress levels really well. We're able to bring that stress level down to a reasonable level because we have purpose. And when we help others, we release hormones in the brain that make us feel good. And again, that can help combat that stress. So that is it for stress and the theories relating to stress. The PowerPoints from this recap session can be found on Teams on lesson 10.1 and 10.2.